Hi everyone, welcome to another series of pure webinars, and we've got a very exciting topic today with two very exciting speakers that I think all of us come quite a long way together. So today's sessions is finding a voice, how the travel industry can unify for good. And we've got two great speakers today. We've got, first of all, George Morgan-Grenville, someone that I've known for quite a while. I think we met the first time in San Diego in 2007 at an American Express luxury conference. And believe it or not, he was one of the target on the list that absolutely wanted to talk to. And he noticing me. I met on that day someone that has been a real guiding force for me and a mentor and someone that I truly respect and I come to see on a regular basis throughout the years to make sure that I can get some insight knowledge of what's happening in the travel industry. And it's George Morgan-Grenville, which is the CEO and founders of Red Savannah. And I have to say that George is someone who's got an incredible visions, an incredible drive, which is a strategist, but also someone who's got an incredible amount of energy, not only in building his companies, but defending his industry whenever it is possible and whenever it is necessary, as he did it into the case of the quarantine, questioning the quarantine, which I'm going to explain. So I'm very glad that he's here, and I'm going to explain his initiative as well. And obviously, Paul Charles from the PC agency. Paul is very well known as being one of the great commentators on travel and tourism. He used to be the ex-communication directors for Richard Branson at Virgin Atlantic. His PR agency is one of the most influential in London, and he's always on a power list of the people who are the most influential and powerful people when it comes to PR. And therefore, it's not surprising that George and Paul join force together, and especially join force for an initiative which is Quash Quarantine. So to give a bit of story of background, I think that we've all been surprised by obviously how COVID-19 hurted us, but also by sometimes the response of our respective governments. And I think that there might be a feeling in an industry which is usually extremely fragmented that we were there on our own. And I think that George and Paul have created initiatives where they've been incredibly inclusive, and they have decided not only to resist, but to try to act together, not for the benefit only of the company, but for the benefit of the industry. So they challenged the government. They went to an initiative which is Quash Quarantine, which we were very happy to support from the onset. And I think it's a great testimony of our industry, of individual trying to take the flag and try to join forces with other people to try to achieve something. And I can't comment enough the initiative, how far they went and how much energy they spend to seize an initiative. And therefore, I'm quite excited also to know all the intricacy of the whole operations, all the challenge they had to face. And so without further ado, I would like everyone to welcome Paul and George on that discussions, which I think is going to be very interesting. And that's why I wanted to personally introduce it myself. So we're there for about an hour for a very exciting time. And Paul and George, over to you.
Thank you very much, Serge. That's very kind of you to introduce us. And we're honored to be here today to explain to the This Is Beyond audience a bit more about the Quash Quarantine campaign, and also, of course, very much around trends in the industry and where we're heading in the next few months. So George is also on video, joining, like myself, from the Gloucestershire area. So hopefully, George, you can hear us okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, Paul. Thanks very much, and Serge, thank you very much for that very very kind introduction. And actually, I would say it's the other way around. I think I've always looked at you as a bit of a mentor. So if we've been mentoring each other, it's probably a disaster for the industry.
Well, we'll find out more about that mentoring later. In the meantime, if anyone, as we're going through, has any questions they'd like to put to George, to Serge, or to myself during the next 55 minutes or so, then please do ask them via the Q&A session on Zoom. George, I'm going to kick off by, we're obviously going to talk about Quash Quarantine and some of the background to it and what we've been doing. But it was your idea in the first place. What was it that frustrated you so much about the government plans at that time to introduce some form of quarantine measure in the UK?
Well, Paul, I don't think I'm alone in waking up one day and suddenly thinking, what on earth is this whole quarantine campaign about? So the government started mooting it in early May that they were going to implement it in June. And I don't think anyone really thought they would go ahead and do it. I think many people believed they should have done it right in the early stages of coronavirus, when there were flights coming in from Iran and Wuhan and many other areas. And no one could really understand why the government hadn't done it. The government kept saying that all their advice was it wouldn't make any difference. Then we went through the lockdown process. Everybody's sales went through the floor. And suddenly the government announced that they're going to put quarantine in place in early June. And it doesn't make any sense. And so I think there's a lot of us all scratching our heads thinking, why? I mean, this sounds like a political decision and not a public health decision. And I think I woke up, in fact, I remember it was the bank holiday weekend at the end of May, and the government was still saying that they were going to implement quarantine on the 8th of June. And I woke up on that Saturday morning and I thought, you know what, enough is enough. Nobody seems to be making any noise about this. And, as an industry, are we going to just take this lying down and see, any chance of a summer recovery being completely annihilated by the implementation of quarantine? And I thought we can't do that. So I wrote a letter to the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, and then I thought, well, she's not going to have a clue who I am, and so maybe this would be better if I got a few people on side. So I emailed several travel companies, and I was amazed at how quickly they came back and how passionate they were in their responses. And I began to realize that people really minded about this, but what it needed was a unifying voice. And so by the end of the weekend, I've got about 70 travel companies and major London hotels together. And the letter went off to Priti Patel on the following Monday.
And in terms of what it said, without going through the whole thing, what were those key messages that you felt had to be got across to the Home Secretary and, in fact, presumably to Boris Johnson and the rest of government as well?
Well, I think firstly that I thought perhaps they were underestimating, or they hadn't really investigated the size of the industry. I mean, this is the UK travel industry is a 213 billion pound industry. It employs about 11% of the UK's workforce, which equates to about 4 million people. And it represents about 9% of GDP. And my view, and what I was trying to communicate to Priti Patel was, if you're going to mess with a sector of the economy that's this size, you better have a very good reason for doing it. So if you go ahead with quarantine, we want to understand what that reason is, on what scientific basis are you going to impose quarantine. And the second part of it was, there needs to be more correlation between what the Foreign Office is saying and what the Home Office is saying. So we had this sort of double whammy of quarantine stopping any inbound business. So the UK hotels and the UK DMCs, the inbound business, was being hammered, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office travel advice against all but essential travel was stopping any outbound travel. But the Home Office and the Foreign Office didn't appear to be talking to each other. And so really it was we want to know on what scientific basis this is going ahead, and do you realize what sort of damage you're about to do? And secondly, why are you implementing some legislation or secondary legislation on which there's been no impact assessment carried out and no consultation?
I suppose when you look at other countries around the world, and obviously we've got a lot of people watching from not just the UK, but all over the world today. When you look at other countries, there were some that introduced quarantine very early on in their pandemic journeys. Is that the ideal, that if you are going to introduce a quarantine, you should have done it in February or March at the start of the pandemic journey and not in June? And that's partly why the UK has suffered.
Well, Paul, I'm not an expert on science, but you know, there are a number of scientific groups out there that have been leading the government, and many of them are subgroups of what became known as SAGE, and in particular I think it's called SPIM. They all have wonderful acronyms, but SPIM I think is the scientific pandemic influenza modeling group. But you know, there are some of the top scientific minds in the country belong to that organization, and as far as I can see, not one of them supported the government in terms of implementing quarantine when it did. Nearly all of them said it would have been sensible to implement it at the beginning of the pandemic, but none of them could understand the basis on which it was being implemented in the middle of the pandemic. In fact, after the R rate had gone below 1.
So you sent this letter to Priti Patel. Have you actually had any response to that letter yet?
That's the $1 million question. The short answer to that is no.
And I'm sure the Home Secretary gets a lot of letters, so she's probably still wading through those. But do you think it's perhaps more that the government was starting to realise at the time that your letter went in and the number of signatories started to grow and the endorsers started to grow, that there was more opposition to this than they had realised at the outset?
Yeah, I think very much so. I mean, look, as this campaign began to get going, and I have to say it got going very fast, much more quickly than I'd anticipated. And for some reason, and you know, largely to do with your help, actually, Paul, it caught the eye of the media, and I think the media were very much in sync with our thinking. And really, the government, I think, were looking for an exit from it, but they equally did not want to admit that they'd got it wrong or that they'd done it for anything other than public health reasons. So they implemented this this arbitrary review date of the 29th of June. But in the background, we were hearing from many MPs privately and through private channels who were saying this is ridiculous. I mean, I'll quote one MP who said, "I'm embarrassed by my own government." This is a very senior MP, very close to number 10. And I think all of them were, well, not all of them, but I think a vast majority of constituency MPs were horrified by what was going on.
And I think probably a lot of us in travel were also horrified. I mean, how did your numbers grow? Because you started off with 70 or 77 endorsers for that first letter, and then the media started picking up the campaign and referring to Quash Quarantine. And then you started to see the numbers grow across the travel community, didn't you? And in fact, not just the travel community.
Yeah, so I think it was very important that in doing this, we were inclusive. I wanted to include everybody who didn't have a voice, who wanted a voice. And in fact, by the end, we had cafes on the coast in England. We had companies that supply linen to the hotel industry. I mean, no one, until you really start to take a more granular look at the travel business, you have no idea of how many indirect jobs are supported by the industry. But predominantly we had tour operators, followed by hotels. And I think what we wanted to show was this: it was not just the luxury end of the business that was complaining. This was the whole industry. And this was, you know, united. This was foes, previously people who were foes being united together in a common aim. And the momentum sort of fed on itself, and it was helped by some of the travel media who were very vocal in their support. So we then put together a simple email address called getgoing@redsavannah.com, and the Get Going list became the sign-up tool for anybody who wanted to put their voice into the campaign. We had well over 500 responses on that, but I felt strongly that we had to keep this as being a UK campaign, and I was really, really delighted by some of the support we had outside of the UK. There were many DMCs around the world who were suffering because of the lack of UK visitors who wanted to sign up, but in the end we had to exclude anybody who wasn't a UK business, because we felt that the government would look for excuses not to listen, but they couldn't. They had to listen if they were all UK companies that were complaining.
There's a certain irony in that, isn't there? Because of course, talk to a London hotelier at the top end, and they'll tell you that 50% of their occupancy is, for example, from Americans. So, you know, the government in a way needs that traffic. It needs that support economically, doesn't it, from US visitors as well as other visitors from Asia and Africa, etc.
Yeah, let me give you an example. I spoke to some of the hotels around Heathrow Airport. Most of them had an occupancy of about 95% in May, early June last year. This year, they had dropped by the beginning of June, pre-quarantine, they had dropped to about 6%. Post-quarantine, they dropped to below 4%. And most of them shut at that point and laid off all their staff, and many of them haven't reopened. So it's been a disaster for the hotel industry in the UK, just as it's been a disaster for the tour operators in the outbound industry.
So the campaign grew, and obviously you were then getting to the 500 level in terms of the number of supporters. I think then you decided to survey that group and actually ask them factually and get some real facts, which the government seemed to be lacking at that point, around the impact that quarantine would have on them. And this was, I think, just before June the 8th, when quarantine was due to start. What did that survey tell you from the horse's mouth, from the CEOs, from the MDs, from the managers and owners of those travel and hospitality companies?
Well, it was horrifying, Paul. So we heard from almost everybody participated in that survey, and once we'd analysed it, almost 2/3 of the companies that we surveyed said that they would have to make redundant anywhere between 25 and 75% of their entire staff. 85% of the companies surveyed said that if quarantine was implemented, they would lose their entire summer book of business. And most worryingly, 1/3 of those surveyed said that if quarantine was implemented, they did not think they would make it through to the end of the year. And in fact, already we are starting to see some major failures in the travel industry announced on an almost daily basis.
So the impact was clear before June the 8th, and you then decided to make sure that information got out there. So that then was fed to media, and indeed you put the core of that information into a second letter to the Home Secretary, Priti Patel. Have you had a reply to that one?
Well, no, I haven't had a reply to that one either, actually. But I guess before that happened, Paul, so I think I felt that we needed to keep the pressure up. And I also felt that there was a very good chance that this legislation was unlawful. And I think, for the benefit of those listening, unlawful when it's applied to legislation doesn't mean that it's illegal. It means that the legislation has been made outside of the law. And therefore, I felt that we should take it to a judicial review and try and get an injunction put on quarantine. So for the weekend of the 5th and 6th of June, I spent the entire weekend locked away with a very good firm of solicitors and also one of the leading barristers in the country. And we really put together a whole strategy of how we could take the government to court and lodge a judicial review.
And that was done at the same time, I think, as several airlines were doing the same thing.
Well, they were, but we didn't know that at the time. Nobody, again, as I was talking, this all came about because of the lack of noise being made. And so I felt, we had the travel industry behind us. We had thousands of companies who wanted to be, or thousands of people who wanted to sign up, companies who had signed up. We had to make the government listen. And so, they weren't answering the letters. They weren't responding to the media. And so we had to make them respond. And in order to do that, we had to look at doing a judicial review. Now, that is a very expensive thing to do. And so it was very clear we had to raise about £300,000 to get that going. Now, let's remember where we're coming from on here. So this was born of a letter 2 weeks before. We had no campaign platform. We had no campaign infrastructure. We had no campaign funding. This was being done by myself and you, Paul, really. And so when you start taking on a judicial review, you are taking on a heap of liability, because if you go in as a co-claimant and you fail, then you are personally going to be, or your company is going to be liable for the government's expenses. So we decided we'd have to try and crowdfund this. And so we set about crowdfunding. So on the Saturday night, I wrote to all of the 500 companies and asked them to contribute. And on Monday, the money started coming in. But at the same time, IAG announced that they were also going to pursue a judicial review. Now, there's a vast difference between being 500 companies who are not united by any sort of common platform and who've got to all subscribe their own money, and an airline that probably has deeper pockets and where there's only 3 of them acting in unison. And so in consultation with the lawyers, we decided that it was better to let the airlines fight this campaign on their own. The result was going to be the same, whether it was us or the airlines doing it. And no one should underestimate the difficulty of getting 500 firms to fight a legal battle against the government. So the fact the airlines had stepped in was a really positive move.
We'll talk about the learnings soon of that, and also the campaign for the future to help the sector. But was it frustrating that here you had a group of 500 like-minded companies and senior individuals who all felt they wanted to quash quarantine, but were perhaps hamstrung by their structures or their ownership or whatever in being able to raise the money to £300,000 fairly quickly? Because that's not a mean task, is it?
No, it's definitely not a mean task. And I think, I'll tell you what really interested me, Paul, in that was that some of the bigger companies were being very slow to put their hand in their pocket. And some of the smaller companies were incredibly generous. And actually, many of the companies that I see at Pure year after year, really good, small, boutique travel companies that know their stuff, know their business. A lot of them were by far the most generous in terms of putting their hand in their pocket. And they were the ones that really minded. you know, some of the big companies did contribute as well, but I could see that it was going to be a massive exercise to raise the 300,000. I think we could have done it, and I think we could have got there, but it was going to take every minute of every hour of every day to get that done. And, you know, in the background, I was still trying to run my own business as well. So, you know, fighting a campaign is a really physically and emotionally exhausting occupation. When you're trying to run a business in the background, and then you've got to suddenly raise 300,000 as well, it's a very difficult proposition. Not insurmountable, but difficult.
So then you decided that actually it would be appropriate at that point to let the airlines continue their legal action, which was later dropped, of course, and actually not go ahead simply because it was obviously difficult to raise that money. And presumably the money would be better within the travel companies themselves at this really difficult time anyway, because everyone's been under pressure.
Yeah, I think to some degree, but I mean, look, we weren't, you know, like all things, if everybody comes together, we were looking, you know, we put a sliding scale in place, and so that we were asking for £500 from the smallest companies and £3,500 from the biggest companies that were turning, you know, had passenger volumes in excess of 125,000 people, and so, you know, these were not really very big sums of money. And I think really, you know, an industry that minds about its future must be prepared every now and then to put its hand in its pocket and fork out when it's for something that will ultimately protect the industry in the future.
So then if we just move on in the story, in the timeline, the quarantine measures came in on June the 8th. The government was obviously determined to go ahead with that once they'd announced it. As you said, they didn't want to be embarrassed. They had to save face to some extent over that period. Then I guess we got word from a senior government source who contacted us to say that the rules would be changed on the 29th of June, which gave us, I guess, some end point, it seemed, for quarantine, that already we were hearing that there would be changes. What happened between you dropping the legal action and the end of June, essentially? Because you kept the momentum going. What was it that propelled that momentum?
Well, I think we did two things. One was to commission the survey through audience.net. And that survey was quite enlightening, actually, in terms of the fact that it said that something like 89% of the population believed that quarantine was going to cause real economic damage. And that fact really needed to be highlighted. But then the second thing was, as you alluded to earlier on, was his second letter to Priti Patel. So, you know, we talked about it a lot, but I think we felt that, you know, we needed to ramp the pressure up. And so the message to Priti Patel was, if the judicial review is found to be unlawful, if the government is found to have acted unlawfully, then our feeling was that she should resign. That, you know, she may not have been the architect of this policy, but she was the person tasked with implementing it, and she appeared to implement it with great gusto. She said in Parliament that she was going to lay out the evidence for everyone to see. As far as I'm aware, she's never done that. And so we felt that the only honourable thing for her to do, if it was found to be unlawful, would be to resign. And I think that was not an unreasonable request. I think any minister that was found to have implemented and sponsored secondary legislation that was found to be unlawful should resign. So I was surprised by how panicky people got by the second letter. There was definitely, you know, I think the problem with this industry is that we're a very conservative industry. The travel industry is not used to rabble-rousing, and it's not used to making a noise. And I think it's why, over the years, the travel industry, despite being such an important part of so many economies around the world, has allowed itself to get beaten up by governments. And I think it's wrong that they do, or we do, as an industry. And so I think what we were trying to explain to everybody was, look, you know, the suffragettes didn't get the vote by writing nice letters to the Home Secretary. The French farmers don't get amazing concessions from their government by writing nice letters to President Macron. We know when something goes wrong for the French farmers, and Serge will know all about this, you know, they are out with their tractors dumping slurry outside the Élysée Palace, or they're blocking the auto route or the ports, and very quickly they get what they want. Unfortunately, in the travel industry, we tend to take everything lying down. And I was slightly concerned that some of our support began to ebb away when we asked Priti Patel to resign, or suggested she should resign. But actually, when we measured it, it was only about 5%. And in the main, there were some hotels, but it was also the trade bodies. And the trade bodies ran a mile at that stage and specifically asked to be excluded. And I thought that was very disappointing, because I thought the trade bodies should have really been standing up to the government at that point. And I know we've had a few back and forths on this, and we can talk about it in a minute at the end. But overall, 95% of our 500 companies stood like true rocks and supported the second letter.
Great. Well, we'll come back to that in a minute. We've got about 25 minutes left. Keep the questions coming in, because we'll come on to questions shortly. So then, essentially, as June went on, the quarantine measures obviously were in place. As I understand it, there's still been no fines levied by the government for anyone breaching the quarantine rules. And then, of course, at the end of June, on the 26th of June, the UK government announced they would stop the blanket quarantine measures. So do you feel then that the government did listen, that the campaign had an impact, albeit with others involved around the UK, but fundamentally they did quash quarantine and listen to what you were saying, didn't they? Yeah,
I think the campaign had an impact. I mean, you know, we'll never know. Would they have stopped quarantine anyway? I mean, I think what we do know is it was absolutely a political and not a public health measure. I think they realised they got it wrong, and they might well have quashed it anyway. But I think certainly it did no harm to get everybody behind the campaign. And I certainly think, from what I've heard, the government were quite taken aback by the vehemence behind this campaign and by the momentum that got going. And I think it was the first time the travel industry had actually snapped at the government and said, you know, we're not taking this lying down.
So do you think there's, I mean, it actually goes down as the shortest ever government policy, I believe, to be then redacted, to be then pulled away. And obviously the government has since opened up travel corridors. Do you think that when you talk about the unity of the travel sector, and you've talked before about the fact that traditional foes came together, do you think then there's scope to create something more detailed in terms of a united action group of some kind? You talked about the trade groups that exist, who clearly have been around for years and had a seat at the government table, and clearly have had the ear of government some time. Yet on this issue, they didn't seem to have the ear of government. So do you think there's an opening now for some form of group to bring together these previous foes and this united group?
Yes, is the short answer to that. I mean, I would prefer it if the major industry groups did what I believe they should do, which is become far more effective at lobbying. You know, the airlines have always been effective at lobbying, and the airlines are not really team players. They look after their own interests, and they're pretty effective on the whole at looking after their own interests, and they have effective lobbying campaigns of their own. The travel industry just never really seems to have managed to bring everybody together, and the problem is there are many divergent interests within the industry. I mean, the travel industry sounds like one sector, but actually there are multiple subsectors within the industry. And so whether you're in an inbound DMC, or you're an outbound tour operator, or you're a hotel, or you're an airport representation company, or a baggage handling company, they've all got different interests. And I think no one trade body has actually stepped up to the plate and said, listen, matters that affect us all, we will become the body that will represent the industry against the government or against any other force that is trying to damage the industry. And I think, I've made this point previously, and I know that one or two of the trade bodies huffed and puffed a bit after I last made it and said, well, it was unfair to say that because they find it's more effective to work behind the scenes. But actually, what does working behind the scenes really mean? It means that you're not then accountable for a failure if you don't achieve anything, because no one knows what you set out to achieve in the first place. And actually, in this particular case, none of the trade bodies were really raising their head above the parapet. And the only reason I started this campaign was because no one was making a noise. And I think it's time that the government take such a big sector of our economy seriously. And the travel and tourism is so important in so many countries around the world. And yet in very few countries do they have do they put their strongest people in as tourism ministers. And in the UK, I don't think we even have a proper tourism minister or someone
certainly not in the cabinet. There's Nigel Huddleston, who's a junior minister, but obviously his voice has not been heard during this pandemic, really.
Where was he? So I think let's say 200, just put it in perspective, 213 billion the travel industry represents. That makes it larger than the entire New Zealand economy put together. But this is a very big part of Britain's GDP, and it should be taken more seriously. So I think, to answer your question, unless one of the trade bodies is willing to stand up and say, look, we're never going to allow a situation like this to happen again. And if the government wishes to implement a piece of possibly, we'll never know now because IAG dropped the case, but possibly unlawful secondary legislation, then we are going to fight it through the courts, and we will make sure that we've got pockets deep enough to do that. And hopefully it will just make the government think twice before they go and implement something for political reasons that has no perceivable public health benefits.
Now, we've got some great questions coming in, which I'll come to in a second. Keep them coming in on the Q&A tab that you've got on the Zoom at the bottom there. So keep typing them into the Q&A. I want to ask, obviously now there are corridors in place. Indeed, today, Greece has opened up to UK flights. Malta's opened up so that British citizens can go there. So we are now seeing an opening up, certainly in Europe, from the UK, of travel, which has got to be good for the sector. But I want to ask you about quarantine's impact a bit more, and all the evidence that is out there that's starting to come through, and you've hinted at it already, is showing that companies are not seeing the level of bookings they might have seen without quarantine, which has put people off, which has made people fearful about traveling. What's your view on where the next few weeks, months, rest of the year are headed? Because the statistics coming out are not looking very rosy.
Paul, I think we are heading for some very rough waters indeed. And I think, June was the time when the industry could potentially have got back on its feet again. That was a time where there was still availability across hotels and villas all over Europe. The industry had an opportunity to take advantage of that available inventory and sell during June. But instead, what actually happened was quarantine was put in place, and that opportunity was lost. And that opportunity has really cost the industry this summer's business. And there are many travel out there that make most of their money during the summer months. Okay, not everybody deals with Europe, and so of course there are other companies that are not dependent on the summer. But for those who are dependent on the summer, this was a massive, massive blow to them. And I think, sadly, I think a lot of them are going to find it's very difficult to get back on their feet again. And I have no doubt that quarantine will be responsible for an enormous loss of jobs in this industry.
Okay, well, let's go to first question from Natasha, who says, it's great to see the commitment to the industry and its employees and travellers. However, with the UK having had the second highest number of deaths from coronavirus, only topped by Russia, far more than Spain or Italy, are you not concerned that you could contribute to rising numbers in the disease if you successfully had quarantine dropped? What motivation do you feel the Home Secretary did have? It cannot be inconsequential for governments to introduce measures like this. So I guess, you know, whilst blanket quarantine has been dropped, what do you say to the medical point, a very important health point, that clearly it's designed to prevent the virus spreading further?
Yeah, I think it's a perfectly fair point to ask, and I've got various responses to that. I mean, I think first of all, the government has two primary responsibilities. One is lives, and the other is livelihoods. But they're mutually inclusive. You cannot have lives without livelihoods, and vice versa. And so, in every government decision, there has to be a sensible balance between public health measures and the economy or economic needs of the nation. And if you starve the nation's economy, the effect on public health is going to be catastrophic. So yes, of course we should be taking coronavirus seriously, and of course we should be doing everything we can to minimize its spread. But what happens if there's a second wave and a third wave and a fourth wave? What happens if no vaccine is found? We cannot lock ourselves down forever, because if we do, we have only a dystopian future to look forward to.
Okay, let's go to the next question. So from Marianne, is ABTA now defunct, having been so reluctant or silent with its support of the industry, and it supposedly speaks for helps administered? So, I mean, ABTA isn't defunct, but at the moment, but it's a question to you. Do you think ABTA, their role is defunct?
Look, I don't really want to get into a quarrel with ABTA. I think they do a lot of good things. I know they got very sidetracked by the refund issue, and I think, you know, if ABTA was sitting here in this debate, they would say that they have, in fact, the argument they've put out is that they're fighting multiple battles on multiple fronts at all times, and therefore it's easy for me to come out and do a one-person campaign on one subject against the government. But that's not half of what they have to face all the time. I think my response to that would be, you know, if ABTA are the de facto trade body that represent most parts of the industry, then where there are matters that are coming up that affect the whole industry, I personally believe they should be more vocal and they should be more willing to take the government on. And I think, you know, these cozy little groups and the cozy little chats, no one knows what's said in those chats. And I think most importantly, the government love compliant trade bodies who don't make a noise, because they can then leaves the government free to do what they want. And I think any government, you know, this was never meant to be a political campaign. You know, if it had been a Labour government that had implemented the same thing, the response would have been exactly the same. This was about protecting our industry. It's not really about politics. But I think if we have an industry body, that industry body must have a duty to stand up and make a noise and fight hard for the industry it purports to represent.
There's a question linked to that from Marcus, who says, thank you, George, for an excellent conversation. How can the UK travel industry form a voice powerful enough for the government to listen? So I guess that goes back to your earlier point that there is a window here.
Well, I've registered
the powerful enough bit. How can it be powerful enough for the government to listen?
I have registered something called the Travel Action Group. I'm not sure really whether we'll take it any further. As I said earlier on, I would much prefer ABTA to take this role on and become more aggressive in the way that they deal with any government. But the industry can, if it wishes, unite. It has got to find somebody or a platform to unite behind. I think it's not an impossible group to try and get together, and it's certainly possible to put a platform out there, but it would require people to put their hand in their pockets and build up a fighting fund. And you know, I don't want to sound like I want to go to war with every government all the time, but I think, you know, just once in a while there is something that really matters. And when you have something that really matters, if you've got no money and no platform to fight it, it is very, very difficult to make the government listen. Yep.
Next question from Norby, who asks, it's a specific point really that he's making about the excellent event, the British Bird Watching, the Bird Fair, which happens in Rutland each year. It's the largest event of its kind, and very successful it is too. Clearly, Norby's making the point here that it's very hard for companies based overseas, obviously, to come in and do business in the UK at an event like that. Certainly this year, next year, whether it goes ahead or not, we don't know. It's stopped many international travel businesses exhibiting, and they've lost a great deal of bookings, obviously, because of not just quarantine, but also other COVID measures. Do you think that because the travel, by its very nature, travel sector is so interconnected, that actually whatever goes on in the UK is clearly going to have a much bigger impact on those beyond the UK, not just in the UK?
Yeah, look, I think the UK has probably the most sophisticated travel sector in the world, and I think it's, you know, in many ways it's a bellwether of what's happening elsewhere around the world. And I think it's incumbent upon the UK industry to set the pace. And I think we should be setting an example and helping others around the world achieve the same things. But you know, this goes beyond just fighting one campaign into how does the industry adapt to coronavirus, and, you know, what does it need to do going forward? And I think there are other aspects that will fall out of COVID-19, and that includes a comprehensive review of the whole supply chain. I mean, I think it's terrible that there have been so many travel companies that have not refunded their clients. And, you know, as an industry, we should be ashamed about that. But we know why it's the case. And unfortunately, there are many tour operators who want to refund their clients who have not been refunded by airlines, or who have sent deposits out to operators or DMCs outside the boundaries of Europe, who can't get those deposits back again. And so the whole supply chain is rotten from the core outwards, and it needs to be re-looked at. So there's ever a pandemic comes like this again, tour operators are in a position to refund their clients without question. And that means resetting the relationship with overseas suppliers, and overseas suppliers or DMCs resetting their relationship with local hotels. There's far too much money being circulated in advance and not being put into trust accounts. So, you know, a second body is ever created. It, you know, in addition to fighting the government, it also, I think, needs to really try and reset the whole supply chain, so that the industry, the cash flows within the industry flow much more freely in times of crisis.
And reset is the word, I guess. We've got 5 minutes. I just want to cover off one more question and then a bit about the future. Last question's from Ennio. in the US, we have a fight between science, the CDC, and the government, the White House. Should we brace ourselves and wait until after the elections in November to start making any plans? Information is too blurry. So I think the point there is the uncertainty continues in the US, like a lot of countries. How on earth is it possible to plan for after the election or even into 2021?
I'm not sure I quite get the question. Plan for what?
Well, Enya doesn't say. Maybe you could quickly type that in. But essentially, I think it's the uncertainty that's continuing between CDC advice from science and Dr. Anthony Fauci, for example, and the White House and the Trump view of reopening the economy. Then you've got some states who are going back into lockdown, and clearly it's a very uncertain picture. That makes it difficult for agents or operators to confirm any plans for their customers, and indeed, Enya says for bringing employees back as well. So does it just mean we have to live with this uncertainty at the moment?
Yeah, look, to a degree, I think we do have to live with the uncertainty at the moment. But I think, it's a slightly self-perpetuating situation. If you lock people down and you keep locking people down, after people become so frightened, they don't want to travel. I mean, the YouGov survey that came out yesterday that said something like only 20% of the population actually want to get on an aeroplane and go overseas. The only way that's going to change is by word of mouth, is people who have gone, who are brave enough to go, coming back and saying, look, we had an amazing time. I mean, everyone I've talked to who's got on an aeroplane in the last 2 weeks said it's an incredibly pleasurable experience going through the airport tonight because they're not crowded. Everyone's very sensible. Everyone's very mindful of each other and respectful. Boarding has become much simpler. People aren't scrambling. Getting off the plane has become much simpler. People are being much more considerate. And actually travel has sort of taken on a whole new dimension. So I think as people go away and come back and report positively, I think travel will start to come back again. And I think for Enya in the US, it's a very difficult situation because, of course, the US is really equates to Europe, and every country in Europe's got a slightly different policy, and every state in the US has got a slightly different policy. And but I think what we should all be focusing on is where our rates are symmetric, we should be encouraging travel between those countries. Where the R rate is asymmetric, then obviously it makes sense to keep quarantine in place. I mean, I think we're all very respectful of the power of this awful disease and the damage that it can do. Nobody wants to have a second wave or a resurgence. But equally, we've just got to keep everything balanced so that we've got to try and keep the economy going. We've got to try and keep the industry going, and yet take the mitigating steps at the same time.
Final question from me to you, George, is a quick 10-second answer, if you wouldn't mind, before I hand back to Serge shortly. How optimistic are you about 2021? And do you think it's going to be as good as 2019 was?
I think it's going to be a very complicated year, 2021, because, of course, let's not forget that the vast majority of bookings that were booked in 2020 deferred or postponed to 2021. So normally, when the industry gets into the fourth quarter this year, it's starting to book for 2021 for the following year. Obviously, January and February next year would typically be very busy booking times. I suspect they're not going to be as busy this year going forward. And I think space is going to be at a premium next year, because where there would normally be masses of space available, I think there will be much less space available. Essentially, you're trying to get 2 years of travel consolidated into 1 year. And I think that might make it very difficult for tour operators. And then I think if there's a second wave, I think people are going to hesitate about booking as well. So I think 2021 is up for grabs at the moment, but I think it will be far from simple. My own view is that things will not normalize in a way that we might like them to before 2022.
The new abnormal. Thank you, George. That's fantastic. I'm going to hand back to Serge. We haven't even talked about sustainable travel, responsible travel. That's all for another day, but obviously very hot topics as well. Serge, back to you.
Thank you, Paul, for obviously moderating these sessions. And George, I can only compliment you for your bravery and for your forceful honesty as well. And I think that I love the fact you give a little nod to the French. That's they know how to protest when it's required, which is I think a kind of a national sport in my country. And but I think there is something interesting in it, and that's why I was so keen that with the two of you on the discussion is that, you know, one of my favorite book of all time was always The Trial by Kafka, which is a kind of a blueprint for existentialism, where you don't have to, if you just accept and you go with the flow, it could end up with your entire demise. And I think that what I really like is that you are a big kind of existentialism in a world where every day looking for doom and gloom, and you really stand up for what you believe and try to change in many ways. And I've contributed certainly to change the course of history. And I think that it's a kind of a real example of smart and goodwill people with strong stamina and a lot of patience can actually change a lot of things for our industry, because as you say, our industry is sometimes very fragmented. And as you clearly mentioned before, like the travel industry is not, we're not used to see the travel industry making a lot of noise. And it's kind of good sometimes that, and I think that's why I think originally the WTTC was created, because nobody was taking this industry very seriously. It was all about chemical and petroleums and cars industries and so on and so on. And I think that what this pandemic has really shown is not only how this industry is important economically for, as you say, we talk about a life, saving life, but also saving livelihood, which is in many ways saving lives in general. But I think how much the travel industry is, or the hospital industry at large, is intricated with our own way of life. This is the way we socialize. And to keep something a bit more simple is that, you know, the first thing when I come in this country, I ask people what a pub than a pub, and I was told that it's called a public place. That's what it's a shortage for pub, because this is the place where people socialize. And I realize that in many ways, hospitality restaurant is a place we socialize, and it's helped our mental health and also us being social animal. And traveling is a way also that we tend to reconnect with our loved ones. And I think there is a tremendous longing for all our customers to come back on track. And therefore we can't thank enough all the people who are, you know, on that journey, like I said, not going with the flow, but try to resist COVID-19, not only in terms of health, but in terms of protecting the livelihoods of many. So thanks to both of you for these amazing discussions, but also for your immense contributions, past, present, and certainly futures for our industry, because you are true leaders in your own field, and you command our respect. So thank you very much. And for audience, I would like to say that obviously look out for more pure webinars or webinars from all our shows. We know that we might have we'll have some exciting news as well about the House of Beyond, and there will be a new program coming also shortly. So look out for more information coming from our companies. And in the meantime, stay safe, keep yourself very passionate, and keep the travel industry going. Thank you very much, all of you, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.